The grand doors of the Meridian Club opened at exactly 7 o'clock. Rich people walked inside wearing expensive clothes and bright smiles. The men wore dark suits that cost more than most people made in a month. The women wore shiny dresses and jewelry that sparkled under the big lights hanging from the ceiling. Marcus Chen stood near the kitchen door, watching the guests arrive. He wore a white shirt, black pants, and a black bow tie. His shoes were old but clean. He had polished them 3 times that morning to make sure they looked good. Marcus was 28 years old, but tonight he felt much older. "Marcus, table 12 needs water," called Sarah, another waiter. She rushed past him carrying a tray of wine glasses. Sarah had been working at the club for 5 years. She knew all the rich people by name and always smiled when they spoke to her, even when they were rude. Marcus picked up a water pitcher and walked toward table 12. He moved quietly the way his supervisor had taught him. "Rich people don't like to notice the help," his supervisor always said. "Be there when they need you, but stay invisible." At table 12 sat 4 people. Marcus knew them from other dinners at the club. There was Mrs. Patterson, who owned 3 houses and complained about everything. Next to her sat Mr. Davis, a banker who never said thank you. Across from them were Mr. and Mrs. Goldman, who owned several hotels in the city. "Finally," Mrs. Patterson said as Marcus filled her glass. She didn't look at him. "The service here gets slower every month." Marcus said nothing. He filled the other glasses and moved to the next table. This was how it always went. The rich people talked about him like he wasn't there. They complained about the food, the temperature, and the service. But they kept coming back every month because the Meridian Club was the most exclusive place in the city. The main dining room was beautiful. The walls were covered with expensive paintings. The tables had white cloths and real silver. Fresh flowers sat in the center of each table. Everything was perfect, just like the rich people expected. Marcus had been working at the club for 2 years. He needed the money badly. His mother was sick and needed expensive medicine. The doctor bills kept growing bigger every month. Marcus also took piano lessons when he could afford them. Music was his dream, but dreams cost money he didn't have. "Table 7 wants more bread," said James, the head waiter. James was 50 years old and had worked at fancy places his whole life. He taught Marcus how to serve the right way. "Stand straight, speak only when spoken to, and never let them see you're tired," James always said. Marcus walked to table 7 with a basket of warm bread. The people there were talking about their vacation homes. One man was bragging about his new yacht. A woman was complaining that her swimming pool needed to be bigger. "Excuse me," the woman said to Marcus. "This bread is cold." Marcus touched the bread. It was still warm from the oven. "I can bring fresh bread from the kitchen," he said politely. "Don't you think I know when bread is cold?" The woman snapped. "Just bring new bread and don't argue with me." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. He walked back to the kitchen, even though he knew the bread was fine. He had learned not to argue with the guests no matter what they said. In the kitchen, the cooks were busy preparing the main course. Steam rose from big pots on the stove. The smell of expensive food filled the air. Marcus had eaten the leftover food here many times. It was better than anything he could afford to buy. "How are they treating you tonight?" asked Rosa, the kitchen manager. She was a kind woman who cared about all the workers. "Same as always," Marcus said with a small smile. "Like I'm not really here." Rosa shook her head. "Someday they'll see who you really are." Marcus picked up fresh bread and returned to the dining room. The guests were getting louder as they drank more wine. Their conversations were about money, business deals, and expensive things they wanted to buy. None of them talked about helping other people or making the world better. At table 3, a group of men were laughing about a news story. One of them had fired 50 workers from his factory to save money. He thought it was funny that the workers were upset about losing their jobs. Marcus served dinner to table after table. Expensive steaks, fresh fish, and vegetables that cost more per plate than Marcus made in a whole day. The rich people ate slowly and talked constantly. They left most of their food uneaten. "This wine tastes cheap," complained a man with gray hair and a golden watch. "For what we pay to eat here, you'd think they could serve better wine." The wine cost $200 per bottle. Marcus made that much money in 3 days of work. But he just nodded and offered to bring a different bottle. As the evening went on, Marcus noticed something sad. These people had everything money could buy, but they didn't seem happy. They complained about things that didn't matter. They were rude to people who worked hard to serve them. They talked about themselves but never asked about anyone else. During a quiet moment, Marcus stood by the window looking out at the city. Far below, he could see regular people walking home from work. They probably had worries about paying bills and taking care of their families just like him. But they also probably treated other people with kindness. "Marcus," called Sarah, "the auction is starting soon. We need to clear these tables and set up for coffee service." Marcus began collecting empty plates. Soon the charity auction would begin. The rich people would bid on expensive items and feel good about giving money to help poor children. But Marcus wondered if they really cared about helping anyone, or if they just wanted to look good in front of their friends. As he worked, Marcus thought about his piano lessons. Tomorrow he had practice at the community center. His teacher said he was getting better every week. Playing music was the only time Marcus felt truly free. When his fingers touched the piano keys, he forgot about rude customers and money problems. He became someone different, someone whose dreams mattered. The guests finished their dinner and moved toward the auction area. Marcus and the other workers quickly cleaned the tables and prepared for the next part of the evening. None of the rich people said thank you or goodbye. To them, the workers were just part of the furniture. But Marcus kept working with quiet dignity. He treated every guest with respect even when they didn't deserve it. His mother had taught him to be kind to everyone, no matter how they treated him. "Your character is shown by how you act when no one important is watching," she always said. Tonight, Marcus had no idea that everything was about to change. The auction room buzzed with excitement. The rich guests had moved from their dinner tables to comfortable chairs arranged in rows. A small stage stood at the front of the room with a wooden podium. Behind it hung a large banner that read, "Children's Hospital Charity Auction." Marcus and the other workers set up a coffee station at the back of the room. They arranged expensive cups and saucers on silver trays. The coffee beans came from a special farm and cost $50 per pound. Most of the guests would drink one sip and forget about their cups. "Make sure the coffee stays hot all night," James told the workers. "These people get angry if their coffee gets cold." Richard Whitmore walked into the room like he owned the place. He was 60 years old with silver hair and wore a suit that cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. Richard owned half the buildings in the city center. He was known for being rude to workers and thinking he was better than everyone else. Richard sat in the front row and immediately started complaining. "The temperature in here is too cold," he announced loudly. "And where's my coffee? I've been waiting for 30 seconds. Marcus hurried over with a cup of fresh coffee. As he set it down, Richard barely looked at him. "About time," Richard muttered. "You people need to move faster." "Yes, sir," Marcus said quietly. He started to walk away. "Wait," Richard called out. "This cup has a spot on it. Bring me a clean one." Marcus looked at the cup. It was perfectly clean, but he took it anyway. "Right away, sir." "These foreign workers," Richard said loudly to his friend sitting nearby. "They can't do anything right. The club should hire Americans who understand how to work properly." Marcus felt his face get hot, but he kept walking. He had heard comments like this many times before. Some of the rich guests thought that anyone who looked different or worked with their hands was not as good as them. The auction was about to begin. A woman in a red dress walked onto the stage. She was the event coordinator, and her job was to make sure the rich people spent lots of money tonight. "Welcome to our monthly charity auction," she announced with a big smile. "Tonight we're raising money for the Children's Hospital. Every dollar you spend will help sick children get better." The crowd clapped politely. Most of them had forgotten why they were really there. They just wanted to show off by bidding on expensive things. "Our first item tonight is a weekend at a luxury resort in Hawaii," the coordinator continued. "The starting bid is $5,000. Hands shot up around the room. The bidding went quickly. Within minutes, someone had paid $15,000 for a weekend vacation. Marcus thought about how that money could pay for his mother's medicine for a whole year. More items came up for auction. A diamond necklace sold for $30,000. A painting by a famous artist went for $50,000. The rich people bid like they were playing a game, not thinking about the money they were spending. Marcus served coffee and small cakes to the guests. He moved quietly between the rows of chairs, trying to stay invisible, but he could hear everything they said. "I only bid on things I actually want," said Mrs. Patterson to her friend. "Some people here just bid to show off. Did you see what Martha wore tonight?" whispered another woman. That dress is so last season. I would never wear something so old. My new car cost more than most people's houses, bragged a young man with gold teeth. But money means nothing to me. I make more in a week than these workers make in a year. The man pointed at Marcus as he said this. Marcus pretended not to hear, but inside he felt angry and sad. These people had so much money they didn't know what to do with it. But instead of being grateful, they used it to feel better than other people. Richard Whitmore won the bid on a golf trip to Scotland. He paid $25,000 without thinking twice. As Marcus refilled his coffee cup, Richard started talking to his friend about workers again. The problem with this country is that we pay these people too much, Richard said. Look at this waiter. He probably makes more money than he deserves just for carrying cups around. You're absolutely right, his friend agreed. They should be grateful for any job they can get. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he poured the coffee. These men had no idea what his life was really like. They didn't know about his sick mother or his dreams of becoming a musician. They saw him as less than human. Sarah noticed Marcus looking upset. She walked over to him during a quiet moment. Don't listen to them, she whispered. They don't know anything about real life. I try not to, Marcus replied. But sometimes it's hard. Just remember why you're here, Sarah said. You're working toward something better. They're just sitting here spending money they didn't earn. The auction continued for another hour. A wine collection sold for $40,000. A week in Paris went for $30,000. The total amount raised was already over $300,000, but the rich people acted like it was pocket change. During a break, Marcus overheard a conversation that made him even more upset. Two women were talking about the charity. I don't really care about sick children, one woman said. I just come to these things to be seen. It's good for my husband's business. Same here, the other woman replied. The hospital probably wastes most of the money anyway. But at least we look like good people for coming. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. These people were pretending to help sick children, but they didn't actually care. They just wanted to feel important and look good to their friends. As the evening went on, the guests became more rude. They had been drinking wine with dinner and more wine during the auction. Some of them started treating the workers even worse than usual. Boy, Richard called out to Marcus. Bring me another coffee, and this time make sure it's hot. Marcus was not a boy. He was 28 years old and had a college degree. But Richard called him boy to make him feel small and unimportant. When Marcus brought the coffee, Richard tested it with his finger. This is barely warm, he complained loudly. Can't you people do anything right? Other guests turned to look. Marcus felt embarrassed and angry, but he kept his voice calm. I'll bring you fresh coffee right away, sir. Forget it, Richard said with a wave of his hand. Just stay away from me. You're all incompetent. The word incompetent meant that Richard thought Marcus was stupid and couldn't do his job properly. But Marcus had been doing his job perfectly all night. Richard was just looking for reasons to be mean. Other workers in the room exchanged worried looks. They had all been treated badly by rich guests before, but tonight seemed worse than usual. The guests were being extra rude and demanding. Marcus went back to the coffee station and took deep breaths. He thought about his mother at home, probably watching television and trying not to worry about the medical bills. He thought about his piano lessons and the music that made him feel alive. He reminded himself that this job was just temporary, a way to pay for the things that really mattered. The auction coordinator announced that they had raised $400,000 for the hospital. The crowd clapped and congratulated themselves. They felt good about giving money to help children, even though most of them had spent more money on the auction items than they actually donated to charity. And now, the coordinator said with excitement, we have a special treat. The famous pianist Jonathan Rivers was supposed to perform for us tonight. The crowd murmured with interest. Jonathan Rivers was known around the world for his beautiful piano playing. Tickets to his concerts cost hundreds of dollars and were always sold out. Unfortunately, the coordinator continued, and her smile faded. Mr. Rivers has become ill and cannot perform tonight. The crowd groaned with disappointment. Some people started talking about leaving early. Marcus was clearing empty cups from a table near the stage when he heard this announcement. He had studied Jonathan Rivers' music and knew many of his pieces by heart. Marcus had dreamed of playing like that someday, in front of people who appreciated beautiful music. But tonight he was just a waiter in a room full of people who barely saw him as human. He had no idea that in just a few minutes everything in his life was about to change completely. The coordinator stood on the stage looking worried. She held her phone in one hand and kept checking it for messages. The famous pianist was definitely not coming, and the rich guests were getting restless. "This is unacceptable," Richard Whitmore said loudly from his front row seat. "We paid good money for this event. They promised us entertainment." "I agree," said Mrs. Patterson. "If they can't provide what they promised, they should give us our money back." Other guests began complaining too. Some stood up and started walking toward the exit. The coordinator looked panic-stricken. She had worked for months to organize this event, and now it was falling apart. "Please, everyone," the coordinator called out. "Give me just a few minutes. I'm trying to find another performer." She rushed off the stage and began making phone calls in the corner of the room. Marcus watched her dial number after number, but each call ended with disappointment. It was Saturday night, and most musicians were already performing somewhere else. Marcus continued collecting empty cups and plates. He moved quietly around the room, listening to the guests complain about the ruined evening. They had already raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for sick children, but all they cared about was their entertainment. "I knew we should have gone to the opera instead," one woman said to her husband. "Next time I'm not donating any money until I see the full program," another man announced. Marcus felt sorry for the coordinator. She was a nice woman who worked hard to help the hospital raise money. It wasn't her fault that the pianist got sick. But the rich guests didn't care about that. They only cared about getting what they wanted. Near the coffee station, Marcus overheard Sarah talking to James about the situation. "Poor woman," Sarah said, nodding toward the coordinator. "She's been planning this event for 6 months. "These people have no patience," James replied. "They think money can solve every problem instantly." Marcus thought about the grand piano sitting on the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, probably worth more than he would make in 10 years. He had been looking at it all evening, imagining what it would feel like to play such a perfect piano. At the community center where Marcus took lessons, the piano was old and some keys didn't work properly. But even on that broken piano, Marcus could create beautiful music. He had been studying piano since he was 12 years old. His first teacher said he had natural talent that just needed practice and training. The coordinator finished another phone call and shook her head in frustration. She looked like she might cry. Several more guests had left the room, and others were putting on their coats. Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He walked over to the coordinator during a quiet moment when she wasn't on the phone. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. The coordinator looked up at him with tired eyes. "Yes, do you need something?" Marcus felt nervous, but he forced himself to speak. "I couldn't help but overhear about the pianist. I know this might sound strange, but I play piano." The coordinator stared at him for a moment like she didn't understand what he had said. "You play piano?" "Yes, ma'am. I've been studying for 16 years. I know many classical pieces, including some by the composer who was supposed to perform tonight." The coordinator looked Marcus up and down. He was still wearing his waiter uniform with the white shirt and black bow tie. Coffee stains marked his sleeve from serving drinks all evening. "You're a waiter," she said, not in a mean way, but like she was trying to understand. "Yes, ma'am. But I also study music. I take lessons when I can afford them. I know this is unusual, but if you need someone to play..." The coordinator's phone rang again before Marcus could finish. She answered it quickly, hoping it was good news about finding a real pianist. But after a few seconds, her face fell again. "That was my last option," she said to Marcus after hanging up. "Every professional musician in the city is already booked or lives too far away." She looked at the stage where angry guests were demanding their money back. Then she looked at Marcus in his waiter uniform. It was clear she was desperate. "What kind of music can you play?" she asked. "Classical mostly. Chopin, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. I also know some modern pieces and jazz standards." The coordinator bit her lip, thinking hard. "These are very important people," she said. "They're used to the best performers in the world." "If you make a mistake..." "I understand," Marcus said. "But if you don't mind me saying so, the evening is already ruined." "What's the worst that could happen?" She looked around the room again. More guests were leaving every minute. The whole event was falling apart. "Can you really play well enough for this crowd?" she asked. Marcus thought about all the hours he had practiced on the old piano at the community center. He thought about his teacher who said he had the skill to perform professionally if he just had the right opportunities. "Yes, ma'am. I believe I can." The coordinator closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, she looked determined. "Okay," she said, "but I need to warn you, these people can be very critical. If they don't like your playing, they might be rude." Marcus almost laughed. "Ma'am, I've been serving them all evening. I know exactly how rude they can be." "Right," she said with a small smile. "I forgot you've been dealing with them all night." She looked at her watch. "Can you be ready in 10 minutes? I need to make an announcement and try to convince people to stay." "I just need a moment to warm up and test the piano," Marcus said. "What should I play?" "Whatever you think is best. Something beautiful that will make them forget about the famous pianist they were expecting." Marcus nodded and walked toward the stage. His heart was beating fast, but he felt excited rather than nervous. This was the chance he had been dreaming about for years. James appeared beside him as he reached the piano. "What are you doing?" the head waiter asked. "I'm going to play piano for them," Marcus said quietly. James looked shocked. "Are you crazy? These people will destroy you if you're not perfect." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but maybe they'll hear something beautiful." He sat down at the piano bench and lifted the cover off the keys. The piano was even more beautiful up close. The keys were perfectly clean and white. When he pressed one gently, the sound was pure and clear. Sarah appeared on his other side. "Marcus, are you sure about this?" "No," he admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The coordinator had returned to the stage and was tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. The room slowly quieted down as people turned to look at her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I have good news. We do have a pianist who can perform for you tonight." Some of the guests who were leaving stopped and came back to their seats. Others looked skeptical. "Who is it?" Richard Whitmore called out. "Someone we've heard of?" The coordinator hesitated for just a moment. "The performer is, well, he's someone who has been with us all evening. Someone who knows good music and has been studying piano for many years." Marcus could see the confusion on people's faces. They were trying to figure out who she was talking about. "Ladies and gentlemen," the coordinator continued, "please welcome our pianist for this evening." She gestured toward Marcus, who stood up from the piano bench and gave a small bow. The room fell completely silent as the guests realized that their waiter was about to perform for them. Richard Whitmore's mouth dropped open. Mrs. Patterson looked like she had seen a ghost. Other guests began whispering to each other in shock and disbelief. Marcus sat back down at the piano and adjusted the bench. He could feel hundreds of eyes staring at him. These people had ignored him all evening, treated him like he was invisible. Now they were about to discover who he really was. Marcus sat at the beautiful grand piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys. The room was completely quiet except for the sound of people shifting in their chairs. He could feel every pair of eyes watching him, waiting to see what would happen. Some guests looked angry. They had expected a world-famous pianist, not their waiter. Others looked curious, wondering if this was some kind of joke. A few people were already reaching for their coats, ready to leave if Marcus embarrassed himself. Richard Whitmore leaned forward in his front row seat, a mean smile on his face. "This should be interesting," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "I wonder if he can play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Several people laughed at Richard's joke. Mrs. Patterson shook her head and whispered to her friend, "This is what happens when you trust the help to do important jobs." Marcus heard the comments, but he tried not to let them bother him. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought about his piano teacher's advice. Music comes from the heart, not from what other people think of you. He opened his eyes and looked at the keys. He had decided to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was a piece he knew by heart, one that always made him feel peaceful and strong. The music told a story of struggle and hope, which felt perfect for this moment. Marcus placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first few notes were soft and uncertain. His hands felt a little stiff from carrying trays and serving drinks all evening. The sound echoed in the large room, and Marcus could hear people whispering. "He's nervous," someone said. "This is going to be terrible." "I told you we should have left," another person complained. The coordinator stood at the side of the stage looking worried. She was probably wondering if she had made a huge mistake by letting a waiter perform for these important people. Marcus tried to ignore the whispers and focus on the music. But the pressure was enormous. These people expected perfection, and any mistake would confirm their belief that he didn't belong on this stage. His fingers fumbled slightly on a difficult passage, and he heard someone snort with laughter. Richard Whitmore was enjoying watching Marcus struggle. Exactly what I expected, Richard said loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus felt his face get hot with embarrassment. For a moment he considered stopping and walking away. It would be easier to go back to being invisible, to serving coffee and pretending these people's opinions didn't matter. But then he thought about his mother at home, fighting her illness with courage every day. He thought about all the hours he had practiced on broken pianos in cold community centers. He thought about his teacher who believed in his talent even when he couldn't afford regular lessons. Marcus took a deep breath and let his shoulders relax. He stopped thinking about the people watching him and started thinking about the music itself. Chopin had written this piece during a difficult time in his own life, when he was far from home and struggling with illness. Slowly, Marcus began to find his rhythm. His fingers started moving more smoothly across the keys. The notes became clearer and more confident. He was still nervous, but the music was starting to take over. The piece grew more complex, and Marcus's hands moved faster. He played a beautiful melody with his right hand while his left hand provided a gentle bass accompaniment. The sound filled the room like water filling a glass. Some of the whispers began to die down. A few people stopped looking at their phones and started paying attention to the music. The melody was so beautiful that it was hard to ignore, even for people who had made up their minds to dislike the performance. Marcus reached a particularly challenging section of the piece. His fingers had to move quickly and precisely to hit all the right notes. In his practice sessions, this was the part where he sometimes made mistakes. But tonight, with everything depending on it, his hands moved perfectly. The music soared through the room like a bird taking flight. Marcus forgot about his waiter uniform and the coffee stains on his sleeve. He forgot about Richard Whitmore's mean comments and Mrs. Patterson's disapproving looks. All that mattered was the conversation between his fingers and the piano keys. A few people in the audience began to sit up straighter in their chairs. The music was more beautiful than they had expected. This wasn't the amateur performance they had predicted. Marcus clearly knew what he was doing, but many guests were still skeptical. They had spent the evening looking down on Marcus and the other workers. It was hard for them to believe that someone they considered beneath them could create something so beautiful. "He's probably just memorized one simple piece," Mrs. Patterson whispered to her friend. "Anyone can do that with enough practice. Wait until he tries something more difficult," her friend replied. "Then we'll see his real skill level." Marcus could sense the doubt in the room even as his playing improved. These people had already decided he wasn't good enough, and it would take something extraordinary to change their minds. He was approaching the most emotional part of the piece, where Chopin had poured his feelings of sadness and longing into the music. Marcus had always connected deeply with this section because it reminded him of his own struggles and dreams. As he played these tender, heartbreaking notes, something began to shift in the room. The music was so beautiful and full of emotion that it was impossible to ignore. Even the people who wanted to dislike Marcus found themselves drawn into the story the music was telling. The melody spoke of someone who had faced hardship but refused to give up hope. It told of dreams that seemed impossible but were worth fighting for. It was the sound of dignity in the face of cruelty, of beauty existing even in difficult circumstances. Richard Whitmore stopped smiling. He had expected to enjoy watching Marcus fail, but instead he was hearing something genuinely moving. The music was making him feel emotions he had tried to bury for years. Other guests began to really listen for the first time. They had come to the auction to show off their wealth and feel superior to others. But Marcus's playing was reminding them of something they had forgotten, that beauty and talent could come from unexpected places. Marcus was completely lost in the music now. His fingers moved across the keys like they had been doing this dance for years. Every note was perfect, not because Marcus was trying to impress anyone, but because he was telling his story through Chopin's music. The piece built to a powerful climax, with both hands working together to create a sound that filled every corner of the room. Marcus's whole body moved with the rhythm, and his face showed the deep emotion he was feeling. Then gradually the music became softer again. The final section was like a gentle goodbye, full of hope despite all the sadness that had come before. Marcus played these last notes with such tenderness that several people in the audience felt tears forming in their eyes. As the final note faded away, the room remained completely silent. Marcus kept his hands on the keys for a moment, not ready to leave the beautiful world the music had created. Slowly, he lifted his hands and turned to look at the audience. The same people who had been making jokes and rude comments now sat in stunned silence. They were looking at him like they had never seen him before. Because in a way, they hadn't. For the first time all evening, they were seeing Marcus as he really was. Not a servant to be ignored, but a human being with extraordinary talent and deep feelings. The silence in the room felt heavy and strange. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat as he sat at the piano bench. The guests stared at him with wide eyes like they were trying to understand what had just happened. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. The same people who had been laughing and making jokes were now completely quiet. Marcus had played Chopin's ballade perfectly, and the beauty of the music had surprised everyone. Richard Whitmore sat in his front row seat with his mouth slightly open. He had expected to enjoy watching Marcus embarrass himself. Instead, he had just heard one of the most beautiful piano performances of his life. The man he had been calling boy and treating like dirt was clearly a master musician. Mrs. Patterson gripped her husband's arm tightly. She was known for complaining about everything, but she couldn't find anything wrong with what she had just heard. The music had been flawless and deeply moving. Marcus decided not to stop with just one piece. He could see that the audience was finally paying attention, really listening to him for the first time all evening. This was his chance to show them who he truly was. Without saying a word, he turned back to the piano and began playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. This piece was even more challenging than the Chopin, requiring incredible technical skill and emotional depth. Most amateur pianists couldn't even attempt it. The opening notes were bold and dramatic. Marcus's hands moved across the keys with confidence now. All his nervousness had disappeared. He was in his element, doing what he was born to do. The Rachmaninoff piece told a different story than the Chopin. Where the Chopin had been gentle and melancholy, this music was passionate and powerful. It spoke of great love, terrible loss, and ultimate triumph. Marcus poured 16 years of musical study into every note. As the music grew more intense, people began leaning forward in their chairs. They had never heard anyone play with such skill and emotion right in front of them. Concert halls and recordings couldn't capture the immediate power of live music, performed by someone with real talent. The coordinator stood at the side of the stage, hardly able to believe what she was witnessing. She had taken a huge risk by letting a waiter perform for these demanding guests. Now she realized she was watching something extraordinary unfold. Sarah and James watched from the back of the room with pride and amazement. They had worked alongside Marcus for years, knowing he was different from the other waiters. He was always quiet and thoughtful, never complaining about the rude treatment from guests. Now they understood why. Marcus had been carrying this incredible gift inside him all along. The music reached a section that required Marcus to play rapid, complex passages with both hands. His fingers flew across the keys so quickly they looked like a blur. Every note was crystal clear and perfectly timed. This was the kind of playing that took decades to master. A woman in the third row began to cry quietly. The music was so beautiful it overwhelmed her emotions. She had spent the evening complaining about small problems and showing off her expensive jewelry. Now she was remembering what it felt like to experience something truly meaningful. Richard Whitmore felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The music was awakening emotions he had buried under layers of anger and greed. He thought about his childhood when he used to love listening to his grandmother play piano. Before he became obsessed with money and power, he had known how to appreciate beauty. The young man with gold teeth who had bragged about his expensive car sat perfectly still. Earlier he had laughed about making more money than the workers. Now he was realizing that all his wealth couldn't buy him the ability to create something as beautiful as what Marcus was playing. Marcus transitioned into the most famous melody of the piece. This was music that could make people fall in love or help them remember lost loved ones. He played it with such tenderness that it felt like he was speaking directly to each person's heart. The businessman who had joked about firing 50 workers felt ashamed of himself. Marcus's playing reminded him that every person had value beyond their usefulness to his company. The man he had been looking down on all evening was revealing depths of talent and sensitivity that humbled him. As the music continued, something magical began happening in the room. The artificial barriers between the rich guests and the working staff started to crumble. The guests began to see Marcus not as a servant, but as an artist who had been sharing his gifts with unworthy people all evening. Mrs. Patterson thought about how rudely she had spoken to Marcus earlier, complaining about bread that wasn't really cold and making demands about service. She felt embarrassed remembering her behavior. This man had been serving her with grace and dignity while carrying extraordinary talent inside himself. The music built to an incredible climax that required Marcus to use the full range of the piano. His left hand played deep, powerful bass notes while his right hand soared in the highest register. The sound filled the room like a symphony orchestra, even though it came from just one instrument and one pair of hands. People who had been checking their phones and talking about leaving early were now completely absorbed in the performance. Marcus's playing was so compelling that it commanded their full attention. They couldn't look away or think about anything else. A successful lawyer who owned 3 vacation homes found himself thinking about his own dreams. As a young man, he had wanted to be a teacher and help children learn. Somewhere along the way, he had gotten distracted by money and status. Marcus's music reminded him of the person he used to be before he became cynical and materialistic. The melody moved through different moods and emotions. Sometimes it was triumphant and joyful. Other times it was sad and reflective. Marcus played each section with complete understanding of what the composer had intended. He wasn't just hitting the right notes. He was telling the story the music was meant to tell. Richard Whitmore felt tears forming in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. He was known for being tough and unfeeling in business, but this music was reaching a part of his soul that he thought had died years ago. He remembered being young and believing that life was about more than accumulating wealth and power. The woman who had said she didn't care about sick children felt deeply ashamed. Marcus's playing revealed the emptiness of her attitude. Here was someone who clearly understood suffering and hope. Someone who could transform pain into beauty. She realized how shallow and selfish she had been. As Marcus approached the final section of the piece, the entire room was transformed. These people who had spent the evening being rude and dismissive were now experiencing something that money couldn't buy. They were witnessing true artistry, performed by someone they had treated as invisible. The music spoke of redemption and the triumph of the human spirit. It told the story of someone who had faced difficulties but refused to let them destroy his capacity for beauty and love. Marcus was playing his own life story, and everyone in the room could feel it. The final notes rang out with power and majesty. Marcus's hands moved with complete confidence and grace. He had taken control of the room not through wealth or status, but through the pure force of his talent and the depth of his artistic soul. As the last note faded into silence, Marcus sat quietly at the piano for a moment. He had just given the performance of his life in front of people who had spent the evening treating him like he didn't matter. Now everything had changed. The last note of Rachmaninoff's piano concerto hung in the air like a prayer. Marcus kept his hands on the keys, not ready to break the spell the music had created. The room was so quiet that he could hear the soft ticking of the expensive clock on the wall. For what felt like forever, nobody moved or spoke. The guests sat frozen in their chairs, their faces showing a mixture of shock, wonder, and something that looked like shame. They had just witnessed something extraordinary from a person they had been treating as less than human all evening. Marcus slowly lifted his hands from the piano and turned to face the audience. His waiter uniform was wrinkled and his bow tie was slightly crooked, but his face showed the quiet dignity of someone who had just shared his deepest gift with the world. The silence stretched on for several more heartbeats. Then slowly one person began to clap. It was an elderly man in the back row who had said very little all evening. His applause was slow and deliberate, like he was in church. The sound seemed to wake up the rest of the room. Suddenly everyone was clapping. But this wasn't the polite social applause they had given during the auction. This was something deeper, the kind of response that comes when people recognize they have witnessed true greatness. The applause grew louder and more intense. People began standing up one by one until the entire room was on its feet, giving Marcus a standing ovation. Many of them had tears in their eyes. Some were crying openly, overwhelmed by the beauty of what they had just experienced. Richard Whitmore stood with the rest, though his face showed a complicated mixture of emotions. The man he had been calling boy and making racist comments about had just revealed himself to be more talented than anyone Richard had ever met. The shame of his earlier behavior weighed heavily on him. Mrs. Patterson was crying into her expensive handkerchief. She kept thinking about how rudely she had spoken to Marcus, how she had complained about perfectly good bread, and treated him like a servant who existed only for her convenience. Now she realized she had been in the presence of an artist all evening. The coordinator was clapping so hard her hands hurt. She had taken the biggest risk of her career by letting a waiter perform for these important guests. Now she knew it was the best decision she had ever made. The evening had been saved, and more than that, it had become something magical. Marcus stood up from the piano bench and gave a small, humble bow. He wasn't used to this kind of attention or praise. For 2 years at the club, he had been invisible. Tonight, for the first time, these people were really seeing him. "Extraordinary," called out a woman from the middle of the room. "That was absolutely extraordinary." "I've heard Rachmaninoff played at Carnegie Hall," said another man. "This was just as good as anything I've heard there." The businessman who had bragged about firing workers stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Marcus, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. What you just did, it was incredible." Marcus nodded graciously. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was calm and steady, showing no anger toward people who had treated him badly all evening. More people began approaching the stage. They wanted to shake Marcus's hand, to apologize for their earlier behavior, to understand how someone they had ignored could possess such extraordinary talent. "Where did you study music?" asked a woman who owned several art galleries. "Who was your teacher?" "I studied at the community college," Marcus replied. "My teacher is Mrs. Rodriguez. She teaches piano lessons at the community center for people who can't afford private instruction." The guests exchanged glances. They spent thousands of dollars on piano lessons for their children with famous instructors. But those expensive lessons had never produced anything close to what they had just heard from someone who learned at a community center. "How long have you been playing?" asked another guest. 16 years, Marcus said. "I started when I was 12. My mother saved up money to buy me an old piano from a garage sale." A garage sale piano. These people owned pianos that cost more than cars, but Marcus had learned to create magic on an instrument his mother bought secondhand. It made them realize how little they understood about talent and dedication. Richard Whitmore had been standing at the edge of the crowd, working up the courage to approach Marcus. Finally, he pushed through to the front. His face was red with embarrassment and emotion. "Young man," he said, his voice much quieter than it had been all evening, "I need to apologize to you. The things I said, the way I treated you, there's no excuse for it." Marcus looked at Richard with clear, honest eyes. "Apology accepted, sir." "No, you don't understand," Richard continued. "I was cruel to you. I made assumptions about you based on your job and your appearance. I was wrong about everything. We all make mistakes," Marcus said gently. "What matters is what we do next." Richard was amazed by Marcus's grace. After being treated terribly all evening, Marcus wasn't angry or bitter. He was responding with kindness and forgiveness that Richard didn't deserve. "What are your plans?" asked the art gallery owner. "Are you performing professionally?" Marcus shook his head. "I work here to pay for my mother's medical bills and my music lessons. Someday I hope to audition for music schools, but right now I need to focus on taking care of my family." The guests felt ashamed hearing this. They had spent more money on auction items that night than Marcus probably made in a year. While they were buying unnecessary luxuries, he was working multiple jobs to care for his sick mother and pursue his dreams. "What's your mother's condition?" asked a woman whose husband owned several hospitals. "She has a chronic illness that requires expensive medication," Marcus explained. "The treatments help, but they cost more than our insurance covers." Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable. They carried credit cards that could pay for Marcus's mother's treatment without affecting their budgets at all. Yet they had spent the evening treating her son like he was beneath their notice. Sarah and James had moved closer to the stage, beaming with pride. They had always known Marcus was special, but even they hadn't known about his incredible musical talent. Seeing him receive the recognition he deserved made them feel proud to know him. "Marcus," the coordinator said, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saving our evening. You turned what could have been a disaster into something beautiful." "It was my pleasure," Marcus replied. "Music is meant to be shared." The crowd began discussing among themselves, but now their conversations were different from earlier in the evening. Instead of bragging about their possessions or gossiping about other people, they were talking about Marcus's performance and what it meant. "I feel like I've been living my whole life wrong," one woman confided to her friend. "That young man has more dignity and talent in his little finger than I have in my whole body. He made me remember why I used to love music," said a man who collected expensive instruments but rarely played them. "I haven't felt anything like that in years." Marcus remained humble and gracious as people continued to approach him. He answered their questions patiently and thanked them for their kind words. He didn't act superior or try to make them feel worse about their earlier behavior. He simply accepted their praise with the same quiet dignity he had shown all evening. The transformation in the room was complete. These people who had arrived thinking they were better than everyone else had discovered that true worth had nothing to do with money or social status. They had learned that extraordinary people could be found in unexpected places, serving them coffee while carrying incredible gifts inside themselves. Most importantly, they had been reminded of their own humanity. Marcus's music had touched something deep inside them, something they had forgotten in their pursuit of wealth and status. For the first time in years, many of them felt truly moved by something that money couldn't buy. As the final notes of Marcus's incredible performance faded away, the room remained in stunned silence for several heartbeats. Then, as if a dam had burst, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the audience. But this wasn't the polite, expected clapping they had given during the charity auction. This was something much deeper and more genuine. The applause started slowly with one or two people, then spread like wildfire through the room. People weren't just clapping with their hands, they were clapping with their hearts, their souls, their entire beings. Many had tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the beauty and power of what they had just witnessed. Marcus stood quietly beside the piano, still wearing his waiter's uniform with the slightly wrinkled white shirt and black bow tie. His name tag still read Marcus Service Staff, but everything else about how people saw him had changed completely in the span of 20 minutes. Richard Whitmore, the man who had been most cruel to Marcus throughout the evening, stood with tears rolling down his cheeks. His expensive suit and gold watch suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the gift Marcus had just shared with them. The same hands that had served Richard coffee with quiet dignity had just created something more valuable than all of Richard's real estate properties combined. "Bravo," called out someone from the back of the room. "That was magnificent." "I've never heard anything so beautiful," sobbed Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had complained about everything all evening. She thought about how she had criticized Marcus for supposedly cold bread and demanded better service. Now she realized she had been in the presence of greatness and had been too blind to see it. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People stood on their feet, clapping until their hands were sore. Some were laughing through their tears, amazed by the unexpected gift they had received. Others stood in reverent silence, still processing what they had experienced. Marcus remained humble and gracious, giving small bows to acknowledge the applause. He didn't look proud or superior, even though he had just proven himself to be more talented than anyone in the room had imagined possible. His face showed the same quiet dignity he had maintained all evening, whether he was serving drinks or playing piano. The coordinator finally stepped forward to quiet the crowd. She was crying too, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Her evening had been saved by the most unlikely hero imaginable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, her voice shaking with emotion, "I think we can all agree that we have just witnessed something truly extraordinary." More applause erupted. People were looking at Marcus like they had never seen him before. In a way, they hadn't. For the entire evening, they had seen only a waiter, a servant, someone whose job was to be invisible and serve their needs. Now they were seeing Marcus as he truly was, an artist, a human being with incredible depth and talent. Several guests began approaching the stage. They wanted to talk to Marcus, to understand how they had been so wrong about him, to somehow make up for their earlier behavior. The art gallery owner was among the first to reach him. "Marcus," she said, her voice full of respect, "that performance was absolutely remarkable. Where have you performed before? What conservatories have you attended?" Marcus smiled gently. "I haven't performed professionally before tonight. I study music when I can afford lessons, but I've never had the opportunity to play for an audience like this." The guests exchanged amazed glances. This level of skill and artistry, and Marcus was essentially self-taught, it made their expensive music educations and private instructors seem insignificant in comparison. "Your technique is flawless," said a man who served on the board of the City Symphony. "The way you interpreted both pieces, you understand the music on a level that most professional pianists never reach." "Music has always spoken to me," Marcus replied simply. "When I play, I try to share what the composer was feeling when they wrote the piece." Richard Whitmore had been standing at the edge of the crowd, gathering the courage to approach Marcus. His earlier arrogance had been completely shattered. The man he had treated with such contempt had just revealed himself to be more accomplished than Richard could ever hope to be. Finally, Richard pushed through the crowd. His face was red with shame and emotion. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you." Marcus turned to face Richard with the same calm, respectful expression he had worn all evening. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction at seeing Richard humbled, just the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything he did. "I owe you more than an apology," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "The way I treated you tonight, the things I said, there's no excuse for any of it. You served me with grace and professionalism all evening while I was cruel and dismissive." "It's okay, Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said gently. "We all have difficult moments." Richard was amazed by Marcus's response. After being treated terribly, Marcus wasn't bitter or angry. He was showing more class and forgiveness than Richard had ever demonstrated in his life. "No, it's not okay," Richard insisted. "You have more talent in your little finger than I have in my entire body. You have more dignity and character than anyone in this room, and I treated you like you were nothing." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. With shaking hands, he wrote out a check and handed it to Marcus. "This is for your mother's medical bills," he said quietly. "It's the least I can do." Marcus looked at the check and his eyes widened. Richard had written it for $50,000, enough to cover his mother's treatments for years. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Please," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Let me do this one decent thing. After how I behaved tonight, I need to make amends somehow." Other guests were pulling out their phones and checkbooks. The businessman who had bragged about firing workers was calling his assistant to arrange a scholarship fund. The woman who owned hospitals was making notes about covering Marcus's mother's ongoing medical expenses. "Marcus," called out the symphony board member, "I want to arrange an audition for you with our orchestra. We have connections with music schools across the country. Someone with your talent deserves every opportunity." The art gallery owner stepped forward. "I'd like to sponsor a recital for you at my gallery. The city needs to hear your music." Marcus looked around at all these people who had ignored him just an hour earlier. Now they were competing to help him, to support his dreams, to make up for their earlier blindness. But what amazed him most was not their sudden generosity. It was the change he saw in their faces. These people who had spent the evening being shallow and materialistic were remembering what it felt like to be moved by something beautiful. Marcus's music had reminded them that there were things more valuable than money and status. They were seeing themselves clearly for the first time in years, and they didn't like what they saw. "You've given us all a gift tonight," said Mrs. Patterson, approaching with tears still in her eyes. "You showed us who we really are, and more importantly, who we could be." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Music has a way of revealing truth," he said. "It shows us what's real and what's just pretending." The evening had started as a typical charity auction, where rich people bid on expensive items to show off their wealth. But Marcus's unexpected performance had transformed it into something much more meaningful. These guests had been forced to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. They had learned that worth had nothing to do with social status or bank accounts. More importantly, they had been reminded of their own capacity for feeling and appreciation. Marcus's music had touched something deep inside them that had been buried under years of cynicism and materialism. For the first time in a long time, they felt truly alive and connected to something beautiful. As the evening wound down, people continued to approach Marcus with offers of help, expressions of gratitude, and sincere apologies for their earlier behavior. But Marcus handled each interaction with the same grace and humility he had shown all night. He had not just performed beautiful music, he had performed a miracle. He had taken a room full of people who had lost touch with their humanity and reminded them what it meant to be truly human. And he had done it all while wearing a waiter's uniform, proving that greatness could be found in the most unexpected places. 3 months later, Marcus Chen stood backstage at Carnegie Hall adjusting his black concert tuxedo. Through the heavy curtains, he could hear the murmur of the sold-out audience settling into their seats. Tonight was his debut performance with the New York Philharmonic, a dream he had never dared imagine just a few months ago. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. Watching the live stream from the hospital. "So proud of you, my son. Play beautifully tonight," Marcus smiled, remembering how much their lives had changed since that unforgettable evening at the Meridian Club. His mother's medical bills were now completely covered by an anonymous foundation that had been established after his performance. She was receiving the best treatment available, and her health was slowly improving. The scholarship to the Manhattan School of Music had come through within 2 weeks of the charity auction. The symphony board member had kept his promise, arranging not just an audition but a full scholarship that covered tuition, housing, and living expenses. Marcus had been able to quit his job at the club and focus entirely on his music studies. But the changes went far beyond Marcus's personal circumstances. The ripple effects of that one evening had touched many lives in unexpected ways. Richard Whitmore had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone who had been there that night. The real estate mogul who had been known for his cruelty to workers and obsession with profit had become a completely different person. He had established a foundation that provided music education and scholarships for young people from low-income families. That night changed everything for me, Richard had told Marcus during a recent visit to the music school. "Your music reminded me who I used to be before I became so bitter and greedy. You gave me back my soul." Richard had also changed how he treated his employees. He now paid living wages, provided excellent benefits, and treated every worker with respect and dignity. His company had become known as one of the best places to work in the city. Mrs. Patterson had started volunteering at the community center where Marcus used to take piano lessons. She now helped teach music to children whose families couldn't afford private instruction. The woman who had once complained about everything had found joy in helping others discover the beauty of music. "I spent so many years focusing on what was wrong with everything," she had told Marcus. "Your performance showed me how much beauty I was missing by being so negative all the time." The businessman who had bragged about firing workers had reversed his decision and rehired all 50 employees. He had also implemented profit-sharing programs and worker assistance funds. His experience at the auction had made him realize that his success meant nothing if it came at the expense of other people's livelihoods. The woman who had said she didn't care about sick children had become one of the hospital's most dedicated volunteers. She spent 3 days a week reading to young patients and organizing activities to help them cope with their treatments. Marcus's music had awakened her capacity for compassion that she didn't know she possessed. Even the Meridian Club itself had changed. The management had implemented new policies requiring all staff to be treated with respect and dignity. They had also established an employee assistance program that helped workers pursue their dreams and education. The club now hosted monthly performances by talented staff members, giving them opportunities to showcase their abilities. Sarah and James, Marcus's former co-workers, had been promoted to management positions. They used their new roles to ensure that all employees were treated fairly and had opportunities for advancement. The culture of the club had shifted from one that ignored working people to one that valued everyone's contributions. The coordinator who had taken the risk of letting Marcus perform had been promoted to head of special events for the entire city. Her willingness to see potential in unexpected places had made her reputation, and she was now known for creating the most memorable and meaningful events in the region. But perhaps the most important change was in how the wealthy guests treated service workers everywhere they went. The lesson they had learned that night, that extraordinary people could be found in ordinary jobs, had stayed with them. They began seeing waiters, cleaners, drivers, and other workers as human beings worthy of respect and dignity. Marcus himself had grown tremendously as both a musician and a person. His studies at the music school had refined his technique and expanded his repertoire, but the core of his artistry remained the same, the ability to touch people's hearts through music. Tonight's performance was the culmination of everything that had started with that charity auction. Marcus would be playing the same Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 that had transformed the room at the Meridian Club, but this time with a full symphony orchestra and in one of the world's most prestigious concert halls. The orchestra manager appeared at his side. 5 minutes, Marcus. Are you ready? Marcus nodded, feeling surprisingly calm. He had performed this piece many times since that night, but he remembered the lesson he had learned at the club. Music was about sharing truth and beauty, not about impressing people or proving himself worthy. As he walked onto the stage, Marcus was amazed to see familiar faces scattered throughout the Carnegie Hall audience. Richard Whitmore sat in the third row, tears already forming in his eyes before the music even began. Mrs. Patterson was there with a group of her music students from the community center. The coordinator sat with her family, beaming with pride, but it was the sight of his mother in the front row that moved Marcus the most. She had been discharged from the hospital just in time for his debut, healthy enough to attend thanks to the treatment that the foundation had made possible. She wore a simple dress and carried the same proud smile she had worn when he played his first recital on their garage sale piano years ago. Marcus sat at the magnificent concert grand piano and raised his hands. The conductor lifted his baton and the orchestra prepared to begin. But before the first note sounded, Marcus took a moment to look out at the audience. He thought about that evening at the Meridian Club when he had been invisible to these same people who now sat waiting eagerly to hear him play. He remembered serving them coffee while they complained and made cruel comments, never imagining that their waiter carried such gifts inside himself. The experience had taught everyone involved that human worth couldn't be measured by job titles or bank accounts. It had shown them that dignity, talent, and beauty could be found in the most unexpected places. Most importantly, it had reminded them all of their capacity to grow, change, and become better than they had been before. As the first notes of the concerto filled Carnegie Hall, Marcus played not just for the audience in front of him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as invisible. His music carried a message of hope, that every person had value, that dreams were worth pursuing no matter how impossible they seemed, and that kindness and dignity could transform the world one heart at a time. The same hands that had once served coffee to ungrateful guests now commanded the attention of one of the world's greatest orchestras. But Marcus himself hadn't changed. He was still the same humble, gracious person who had worked quietly at the Meridian Club. The difference was that now the world could see him as he truly was, and in homes and offices and restaurants across the city, people who had been at that charity auction were treating service workers with new respect and kindness, remembering the lesson they had learned from a waiter who had shown them the extraordinary power of human dignity and artistic grace.